market's back on. Welcome to Risk Sonar, another episode here with Tony and Luke, and we've got a good one for you guys today. Bull market's back on, obviously, although maybe not quite. I might have jumped the gun a little bit there, but like kind of a little bit maybe.
There's positive signs.
There's positive signs.
To call an inflection in the market is
new highs next week.
Bold.
All right.
That's bold.
That's bold. It might be a little bold. Okay. It may not be. We may not be hitting new highs anytime soon, but we're inching up. We're finding a little bit of progress. Got some good news out there for you today. So we're going to dive into that progress on the truckload side and on the ocean side. We're going to look at volume and we're going to look at rates for both. And both are inching up. Ocean side a little bit more than the truckload side, but nonetheless, a little bit of progress. Stay tuned. We're going to talk more about that. Before we do, I wasn't on the show last week. You were here with, I was at the OTM conference, Oracle, small little startup if you've never heard of them, and a great conference. But what I missed traveling back from Philadelphia was the last show with Tanner before he left us. How was that show?
It was good. I mean, all things went well. So interesting conversation. If you haven't checked it out, hop back in, check it out. But yeah, it's not going to be as fun as this one. I can't imagine.
As fun as this one. By the way, Tony and I were talking before the show, and he said, "Don't say that the bull market's back on." So naturally, those were the first words out of my mouth. Yeah, but in all reality, I am a little more bullish, like truthfully speaking, than you are.
Yeah, and
I'm not as bullish as I came out saying the first sentence of the show, but I am a little more bullish.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm super bearish. It's just I think there are headwinds in the near future that, if this is some positive momentum, that could derail that positive momentum. It might not. Sure. I mean, that's part of it, but I think they're present and have to be acknowledged and see how things react before we call a significant change in a market. And I only say that because it's the equivalent of $13 billion a month, possibly, in terms of hit to consumer spending. It's a pretty big number, and there's, like I said, there's headwinds present that will materialize, in the next 6 weeks or so. So it's not like we've seen volumes increase, 12% in 6 months?
Yeah.
So how much are we going to grow from here? And what does it shape up? What does this lead to the fourth quarter? I think that's the key. Is it doesn't feel like the fourth quarter is going to be all that strong, just given not even this data. I mean, just the concerns going forward from a consumer spend basis. Now, consumers not all freight demand, right? You're seeing government spending finally trickle into the economy, but some of that is around construction and things like that. Yeah. Construction seasons that season slows down,
honestly,
right?
Final month, right?
Yeah,
now.
so that can kind of slow down into the winter months. So I think those are the two, how much of the freight market movement is caused right now. One, how much was it a pull forward from potentials at Yellow and UPS, right? Yep. Shippers being proactive before any potential strikes at either one of those. So a reaction to that. Then you've got government spending. How much of that reaction is baked into this? And then, is the consumer actually continuing to spend money? The answer is yes, to some extent, but has it shifted completely? You'll find out tomorrow if in the Daily Watch, because there's a fun chart within the Daily Watch.
There's a fun chart in the Daily Watch, and it confirms a couple of things that we were talking about. I think consumers are going to cut out, and I could be wrong here, I think when student loan repayments come back, I think they're going to cut out more services than they do goods spending. We've already cut back on goods spending a lot since COVID and all that stuff, and we've seen that reflected in the data. But I think with services, on the other hand, there's only so much in monthly payments consumers can really handle, and when you're trying to keep up with a monthly payment, it makes sense from a budgetary perspective to cut out consistent other monthly expenses. So if you go to the movies once a month, or if you are thinking about getting a certain car, maybe it's, hey, we need to get a cheaper car so you have a lower payment, or you're planning on going out to eat a little bit less, right? That's a service. Now, the thing about going out to eat a little bit less is that the freight still moves because you're still having to buy food and groceries. So that's more so just shifting it a little bit. But anyways, let's go ahead and throw this chart up on the screen just real quickly for us. So this is truckload volume since its February low. Now, February is typically one of the low points in the year. And by the way, ignore those really big dips. Those are the holidays where it seems like it jumps back up a couple days later. So for the most part, February is the lowest point. But nonetheless, we're up 12, almost 12.5% from February lows. So this is a one-year chart. Now, and I think what's important here is we're continuing to climb up for the most part. Last couple of days, we've come off that July peak, but for the most part, we're still climbing a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where we head from here. Tony, traditionally, what does August and September hold for truckload volumes?
I think it's interesting. It's more of what does July hold, because August and September, if you pulled this seasonality up, I mean, it's arguably typically flat.
Pretty flat.
I mean, yeah, they don't move a whole lot.
Yeah.
It's July where you typically see volumes decline because you're post 4th of July, and that's where we broke apart from the seasonality. Seeing this little dip in August, really, I mean, it's not been, I mean, it was 0.5% day over day, but this little bit of a decline really isn't abnormal for August, right? I mean, flat to down, and then it ramps up right at the end of the month because you're leading into Labor Day. So the question is, was this a pull forward for August, and is August weaker, or where you see this decline, or is it sustainable? And I think that's the hardest part, because right now it looks like, again, we've seen this slight decline. I mean, it's not anything major, right? It's nothing to be like, oh, the market's going, volume levels are rapidly returning back to where they were in July before this little ramp up. But it's something to pay attention to because, I mean, even before the actual end of July, volume levels had peaked and started on their way back down.
Right.
Slightly. I mean, we're talking like less than 1% in terms of that movement. But I mean, you start adding these 0.5% down days, day over day, if you put a few of them together, like it takes a pretty significant upward movement to erase that. So
yeah. I think we're actually going to see another upward tick in truckload volume. I don't know when it's going to happen, whether that's August or September, but I think it's going to hit. And the biggest reason is what we're going to look at later, which is a lot of those import booking volumes. We're not going to look at that yet. Before we do, let's just pull up the NTI, which is the truckload spot rates. These are the all-in spot rates. We've seen these before. Again, you've got the year-to-date chart here. Obviously, a lot of down off that May bottom, but pretty much since the May bottom, it's been flat as a pancake.
If you take out the May bottom, well, really, if you took the average right now, including the May bottom and the July, 4th of July peak, the average is right where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And it has been there since April.
But it's not going to stay there.
You think that. I mean, the thing about the freight market as a whole, I mean, it's an open market, right? Barriers to entry are low. So think of it in terms of like economics. It's as close to where you're going to get a supply-demand curve that resembles what you would study in economics. Price is not set by supply and demand together set the price.
Yes.
And when one moves, it moves the price. In this case, we still have way too much supply capacity in the market. It absorbed all of the freight increase that we saw in July, right? It was like a 5% increase or 7% increase.
Absorbed all of it.
It absorbed all of it. Yeah, it had no impact, and it's had no impact on rates. So, I mean, at what point so to that extent, how much demand do we need to increase? How high do volume levels need to get to increase to push rates higher, right? Because you're either going to have a massive surge in volume or an exodus in capacity. You haven't had the exodus to drive rates up. But you also haven't had the demand spike. Even with the 5-7% increase you had in July, it wasn't enough to push rates higher. And that's where I think we're talking offline, just like it doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't feel like spot rates, especially the all-in spot rate, because is going to go that high anytime soon because you have to factor in it's all in, and fuel prices have gone up. How much in the last little bit?
25%.
Yeah, and maybe not that. They're like 25 cents.
25 cents.
Yeah, 25 cents in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's a good chunk of change.
Yeah,
And
the spot rate has it.
In spot rates.
And now, that might be a catalyst to push some of this capacity out of the market, right? Because on a cash flow perspective, carrier revenue effectively staying the same if they're spot market exposed has been since April. Well, now their expenses have gone up significantly, and it's the second largest expense they had. And it comes at a time where they don't really need it. Now, can they offset it with volume? No, because if they're playing in the spot market, they're exposed to spot market freight, and we saw volumes, well, rejections are 3%, right? So that means less volume is flowing into the spot market. That's less volume for them to pick up at these rates, and now their expenses just rose by 25 cents. 25 cents a gallon, right? So on a per mile basis, it's obviously not that, but I mean, you're still talking 3-4 cents a mile.
Yeah, it adds up.
Something like that.
It adds up.
Yeah.
So totally agree with all that. But and I think one interesting catalyst that we're beginning to see though is we're seeing ocean imports start to pick up a little bit, and I think that if that maintains, right? The question is this purchasing managers, are they simply pull forwarding because ocean rates are still historically very low, or are they genuinely predicting that there's going to be more demand coming? We don't really know the answer to that, but we do know is that ocean rates are at the highest level they've been all year, and they're barely off their peak from this time last year. Now, granted, this time last year, they had come off their peak already, but they were still fairly elevated compared to historical levels.
Yep.
And I think that's what we see now. So really the question is this a pull forward or is this demand that's going to progress? And personally, at first I thought it was maybe a pull forward because we had this spike running into the beginning of July and then we started to fall off, but we've come right back up.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting here is when ocean bookings are happening and they're continuing to come up, right? I think when you have that second roof or that second ceiling get hit, I don't know. It's an odd signal tells me that like, okay, they're repurchasing or they're basically holding these levels for a longer period of time than I think we would expect if it was simply just, let's just pull forward some of that inventory early. Yeah. The other thing about pulling inventory early is you have to store it. It's not free. It's not cheap to just pull inventory forward. Yeah. So there's no point in pulling that inventory forward if you don't think somebody's not going to buy it.
Yeah, I don't disagree there. I think the difference is this is the peak in the ocean market, right? This is more traditional where you would see a peak season in the ocean market, and then it falls off in September. We're below this level from last year after we had already fallen so far.
Sure.
I think that is more the concern.
So far.
Yeah, and I think that, so far. I mean, we'll see where it goes. I think part of it, I mean, you listen to some of the numbers from China and they're like super depressed, right? Yeah. I mean, what was it, 24% down in exports, something like that? So, I mean, yeah, that's important because they're the primary driver of the inbound ocean TEU volume index, right? So, I mean, they make up over a third of this index alone from China to the U.S. It's about a third.
Yep.
I mean, I guess the question is like, at what point does if this is this the peak? And if it's the peak, it's not very peaky compared to previous years.
If this is the peak, then it's going to be a very challenging Q4.
Yeah.
If this is the peak.
If it sustains itself, it's going to be a positive at some point. It's just a matter of when does it hit the transportation market too, right? That's the other factor is we may see these volumes come in. They may go sit in a warehouse and not be tendered out for 6 months. Like that's the part. Yes, it looks positive, but you don't know when things are actually going to start moving, right? So it's one of those. And then again, the capacity front in the domestic side.
There's still a lot of capacity on the domestic front. I think we're beginning to see some of that exit. It's still very early, but yes.
And part of me wonders how much of this peak that we saw around the beginning of July in the inbound ocean TEU volume index.
Let's go ahead and throw up the ocean import bookings.
Yeah,
There we go. Look at that. So
Yeah.
37% up from their lows in May. The reason why we didn't choose the February lows is that's Chinese New Year. We always see that dip. But from the lows in May, up 37%, up the highest point year to date by about 7%, and then basically at the peak, maybe down 2 or 3% off this time last year.
Yeah, and I look at this, that basically that first peak, right?
Yeah.
The one we talked about was July 3rd. I'm trying to pull up basically the transit times, because I wonder if some of that has hit the market and is starting to move out. I think
Transit times are on average right now to the U.S. are about 26 days plus an additional 7 days lead time plus an additional 3 days.
These have left the port though, overseas. So don't factor in the lead time.
Okay, well then you still have to factor in the dwell time. So it's about
Yes.
29 days on average.
Yeah, and that's for both coasts.
Yeah. So so this stuff should be either hitting the ports now, or actually, in all reality, it probably started hitting the ports last week, and it's still hitting the ports now.
Overall, in aggregate, yes.
Yeah.
But it will hit the West Coast in 16 or 17 days versus. So you're talking,
And
that was July 3rd. So if it was headed to the West Coast, it was there by July 20th,
Yep.
which is it's way too coincidental that was right around the same time we saw the tender volumes start to pick up. That ramp up started on the 20th. So, I mean, I think part of it's how much is already here.
how much is already here? That second wave
one
that
is
you
not.
see here is definitely not here yet.
No, and what does that do? Like, how does that move once it does get here?
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah, does it move via intermodal? Does it move truckload? Does it sit for a month
does
before
it end up
moves?
in a warehouse somewhere
Yeah.
and just sit there? So
Does it go over to Ontario and hang out there for a little while?
Phoenix,
Right,
right?
Phoenix is
Phoenix
another
has
big
grown tremendously in the past year.
Phoenix isn't nearly as much of a backhaul market as it used to be.
No,
It's still a pretty heavy backhaul market, yes. Not saying it's a great market for a carrier to be in, but relative to where it was just a few years ago, it's not as bad.
no, and I think that's right now's the time to get out of a comfort zone. And if you thought Phoenix was always bad, well, maybe now's the time to take a look. And I
Yeah.
think that from
Start
a carrier
building.
perspective, right? Try to get in there and play around and see how it does. So
Yeah.
looking at transit times to Long Beach, 18.6 days.
Okay, so let's call it 20 days if you
And-
include the.
And 2-day delays.
All right, let's call it 3 weeks, so 21 days, right? If you include the dwell time, so 21 days to get to Long Beach, LA, and then what about to go to New York?
All right, let's pull up New York, New Jersey. It'll be 25 days
25 days, and then what's the
plus-
dwell time?
plus another 2-day.
Okay,
So you're talking
So just under
27
30
days.
days,
So
yeah.
an extra week.
yeah, an extra week.
So I think that's what's going to be interesting is how does this play out over time? Because, I mean, I look at the booking volume, so right, that upstream,
Yeah.
even more upstream, like it's continuing to slide. And I think that to me is the concern is that signal is showing it showed this increase up to basically a week ago. And now, since then it's fallen off. And we're talking about lead times that are in the 7-8 day range that let's see what this index does, the volume index does over the next
Yeah, basically over the next week.
5
right?
days. Yeah. So
So we'll see where that goes. Let's go ahead and pull up ocean rates here real quick. Now, the thing about the ocean rates here is they have had a pretty big spike relative to where they were. So can we pull up that chart? It's the ocean rates, FBXD. Thank you. Here it is. So if you look at this chart, it looks like ocean rates are mooning, right? To use the crypto pump terminology, right? They are mooning. They've doubled since their April lows. They were $1,000 for a TEU from China to North American West Coast. Now they're just a smidge under $2,000. So yes, percentage-wise, big increase. However, they're still down almost 90% from their highs.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, that high was totally just egregious. That's not normal. Basically, where they are right now is they're down about 20% from their historical norms over the last 5 years.
yeah.
Go back, they're slightly above 2019, slightly below 2018 levels.
Yeah, and the key on the ocean is to remember there's what, 10 carriers that
Control
hold
like
90% of the market,
yeah.
something like that.
It's a lot.
So they can push rates up in a way
A little more control.
that a truckload carrier, that's why you might not see, like that reaction to volume is not as impactful on the truckload market in terms of rates as it might be on the ocean side, where they see, hey, volume levels are starting to pick up, like let's push our rates up, because if you look, they like push them right up, right into like the last month.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's where they really started to grow, and that's right around the time that they saw that you saw an uptick in volume levels that they're trying to, which they should, because the ocean carriers are the ones that have been hurting financially. Well, they're still bringing in numbers that they hadn't brought in before, but they're so far off of their profits and revenues from just what, last year, really, 2 years ago, both of them. So it looks a lot worse than it arguably is. The problem is everybody says don't, or like if you take the last 2 years out, well, the last 2 years still happened.
Yeah,
right?
We can't totally ignore them.
Exactly, they happened, and
you can't even really look that much pre-COVID because we're not in that. We don't live in that same world anymore.
No, it's very different.
The world's changed.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into the chart that'll be in the Daily Watch for those Sonar subscribers, looking at the percentage of good spending versus services spending.
Yeah.
Good spending had been on an upward trend for 10 years.
Yeah.
Like until COVID. And then it went from like 36% of total spending to like 42% of total spending by March of 21. And now it's back down to 39. So it's still above.
Back on the trend.
Yeah, it's still back to, it's still above where it was pre-COVID. But if you draw a trend line, it's pretty close to where it should have been as a percentage of total, the total personal consumption expenditures that the BLS puts out. But it's one of those things. It's been this slow kind of decline. But that point alone is why you would expect to see growth in volumes naturally, right? Is that there has been some more, and that's real, so it is adjusted for inflation. You should see growth in volumes every year, year over year, and that's just not the case in the freight market, but you can still see good spending. And some of that has to go with the value of the goods that are being spent, right? Because it's not in volumes, it's in dollars.
Correct. So you could spend 10% more and not move any more freight.
Exactly. So yeah, if you're good say you're buying a $1,500 laptop instead of a $1,000 laptop. Well, the value is more, but it's still the same volume, right? You bought one laptop versus another. So I think that's the key to remember is it's still in dollars, but it's maybe a little more sticky at this closer to 40% of total spending than dropping back down to that closer to 35% spending.
I think you're probably right there. I think you're probably right. So it'll be interesting to see where it comes out. So for Sonar subscribers, stay tuned. Look at the Daily Watch tomorrow. There's going to be a big update. And then for those of you that aren't Sonar subscribers, stay tuned next week and you can come and find out. And of course, always message us online and we'll do our best to respond. And keep you updated and see where the market goes. At the end of the day, we don't know. We're doing our best guess, looking at the data, trying to interpret it. But do
you want to tell the people your bold prediction by the end of the year?
I do have a bold prediction by the end of the year. It's a very bold prediction. I've told a few people this at FreightWaves, and I've been laughed at by every single one of them, probably for good reason. But I'm a bold predictions kind of guy. All right, I'm playing blackjack. Okay, I'm a little bit of a gambler. So. I think spot rates will be higher than contract rates between now and the end of the year at some point.
For reference,
truckload.
Spread between the line haul spot rate and contract rate is currently 74 cents.
It's not.
So you will have to
calculate it. You forgot to carry the one and all this. So
you'll have to have a 74-cent swing for that to happen.
Hey, and it could happen, right?
But you got to have Sonar. to figure it out.
You do have to have someone to figure it out. And listen, the stock market, the NASDAQ was up 45% at one point this year. It's not anymore. It's come down a little bit. It's now up like 39%, but still, it could happen, folks. Could happen.
It's also sentiment driven and not economic driven.
Rates are 100% sentiment driven. Yeah, I mean, to an extent. To an extent.
They are around holidays. I'll give you that one.
Like a perfect example is like a 1,000%, a 1,000% increase in ocean rates. That was sentiment driven, especially when demand had really only increased like 50%. But anyways, we're out of time, folks. We'll see you next week. No time for Tony to offer his rebuttal. I'm right, he's wrong, and we're going to find out in December. Have a fantastic rest of your day.